Okay, this will hopefully be the final video in my demonstration of the geometric forms assignment. As you can see, I did redraw my sphere because I realized I didn't actually want two, and I could then have one that was a little larger, easier to see. So I am going to switch really fast to showing you some of these sphere drawings that we'll use for our reference. Our light source is more like this one or this one. I like this because it does show these different parts of the sphere. So, of course, the center of the highlight, and then getting a little darker as it curves around. Of course, darkest on this side where it's opposite from the light, and then getting a little bit lighter at the edge. This is called reflected light. And it not only does it exist, but it also helps create a contrast between the cast shadow and the shadow that is on the sphere that you are trying to draw. They did make that reflected light very, very bright and very large, so it might just be a very small sliver like that, or I think the best representation is probably this one. So doesn't have to be quite as heavy-handed as it is in this rendering. All right, so we've got some references there to look at, and I will do my best here to draw it. So I will put my shadow in. Now make sure your shadow is very, very light. It is going to start over here, and it is going to be an ellipse. So I am going to draw an ellipse, as we've done with ellipses before. It can be helpful to think about them as having sort of a part that is widest and making sure that they are sort of like following that line. So we've had the angle of our light just coming straight across. So with that in mind, I'm going to try to make my ellipse go straight across. So let's say the widest part of my ellipse is supposed to be here, so I will then try to emulate that. That said, it is a shadow, so if we don't have our perfect ellipse on this one, it's probably not the worst thing in the world. So I think you can probably see that in the video, but it is purposely very, very light. Of course, I'm going to get rid of this part because you don't actually see that part because the sphere itself is blocking it. Having actually these sort of like multiple circles in there, that's not terrible because a lot of times you do have multiple light sources sort of casting multiple shadows that overlap. I am going to eventually, though, get rid of that outline altogether so that you don't see it after I shade it. But that said, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start shading my sphere. I can start at this edge, so just like we've done in the past. And again, our marks are going to follow the shape of our sphere. So we're curving with these. Oops. Helps if I keep this where you can see it. Let's see if I have to bring it toward myself. I will bring that camera toward myself. Oops. All right, well, that was unsuccessful, so hopefully we'll just make this work where it is. All right, so I am shading lightly. I can actually shade all the way around. So since I'm just starting this really lightly, I will actually start at this edge and make sure that that line kind of blends into our shading. So starting at that edge and making your shading start from right there. But I'm already thinking, of course, that we're going to have a gradation. So I'm using these little hatch marks, and I can easily make those hatch marks lighter and farther apart to show that indeed this is going to be transitioning quickly into the highlight right there. All right, turning this as I go. So of course I also have my paper towel handy that I can use, but turning this to make it a little easier. All right, and then as I'm starting to come over to this side, the right side and bottom, we will have our shading on this side be a little bit darker. I'm not going to make it super dark though right away, because as we discussed, we are going to have this reflected light, and this reflected light tends to happen conveniently right here in line with our shadow, so that we can make the reflected light a lighter gray than the dark black of our shadow. Hopefully this shading is turning out all right. I'm wearing my contacts today and I'm not used to wearing them. It's actually harder to see. Anyway, so hopefully though that shading is getting in there right at that edge and coming in, and then we're going to keep going. Now here, like I said, we are going to actually get darker as we go, so I don't have to feather out this shading with light hatch marks like I did on the light side. So to the contrary, we are going to be getting darker, at least on the right-hand side. All right, so since we are going to be getting darker, I can switch over. Now this is kind of funny because we don't want the heaviest stuff to be over here, so we're kind of shading with our darkest part maybe here, and then getting lighter as we go and we connect to this reflected light. So kind of the opposite of what you're used to doing, so it may feel a little odd. Usually I start from the edge and that edge is going to be the darkest, but instead our darkest area is just sort of floating here in the middle. So as you can see, I'm keeping these marks just going with that edge of the sphere. I'm hoping that my camera is adjusting here as I lean over my page and cast a shadow. Can't be helped. So then after that reflected light, we can actually get a bit darker at that edge. And I like to, like I said, I use that cast shadow to determine where I think that reflected light is going to end. And then as I'm going here, I am going to start getting lighter as I move into this lighter side of the sphere. So I do want to make sure though that I move through that full range of value. So I do have an area here where it is going to get quite dark. So all of this may be kind of tedious. It may be difficult to get this full curve here. So one of the things that I can do, rather than just trying to be patient and work slowly, this is another area where I like to employ my graphite stick, and or we can also use our blending tool to create a darker shadow. So I need to probably get my blending tool maybe a little bit darker than it is at the moment, so I am just going to purposely darken that up. And that will allow me to actually shade with my blending tool. Now, especially as I get here to this edge, my blending tool is not great in making hard edges, so it is important that you have your buffer zone, some shading there, and you will then be able to connect to that shading. But that blending tool will definitely help me connect some of that shading on the edge and where I want to have this bright highlight. Now, I've probably taken that a little bit too far. I definitely have. So then I can go back in with my eraser. Could be either eraser here. You may find this one is the better suited. And notice as I'm wanting that to fade out, I start to use little stippling marks with my eraser. So, stippling not just for pencils and pens, also erasers. So I'm just going to keep working on this to get this smoother, so going back and forth between some of my different pencils here. I think the mid-tone is really what I want to work on, so finding a mid-toned pencil, such as, and I'm having to go through all of them, my 2B, finally found that. So again, you do want to start with all of your pencils right there next to you on hand so that it's very easy to transition. We as humans tend to be a bit lazy, so if you don't get your pencils out, you won't necessarily use them. You'll just continue to use the one pencil that's already in your hand. If you have them next to you on your drawing table, you are going to be much more likely to actually use them. Okay, so we haven't been saved from all the tedious work, but using some of those tricks did help. And I am going to go back and forth using these different pencils. So back to my ebony. And just making sure again that all of these marks are very small, but they're also supporting this curving form. So here where I did use the graphite stick, I have a bit of a different texture, so I'm going to go over that area and add to it with some of those marks going in the direction I want to go. So my marks are going to essentially go in this full circle. If you kind of have them more like a crescent, it does tend to just look a little awkward in a drawing. You might see that in a lighting situation, but in a drawing it just doesn't support the form as well. So again, these are sometimes the truths that we choose in order to make our drawing really believable, and sometimes truths that we even exaggerate to make our drawing really feel 3D and believable and dramatic. There are many truths to choose from, so choose the one that is going to work for your art. So often that is drawing exactly what you see in front of you, but sometimes you need to make a specific choice that may not be what you see right in front of you. All right, so I'm even using little tiny like hatch marks here, kind of curving around this white area of the sphere. So light gray to then going all the way to white and making sure that that transition is happening pretty smoothly. So using little hatch marks, using little stippling marks, whether those are created with your pencil or your eraser. All right, so there's a little bit still in here that looks a little bit rough, so again, continuing to work on that until I think it's exactly what I want. All right, so, and we don't need to keep this reflected light really light. We can just have that be more of that middle gray, because then I'm probably going to want my shadow, especially where that shadow starts, to be quite dark. So just as light has a light source, shadow, generally speaking, has a shadow source. So the shadow source in this case is, you guessed it, this ball that is blocking the light. So starting right at that edge, so what was my outline, and working very carefully along that edge. So making sure that that smoothly is going to then transition right into that ball looking like it has a smooth edge. And then once I've created that buffer zone, I'm going to pause and erase that edge of my shadow so that I can still see it, but you probably can't see it in the video. And I can then just move back and forth toward that line that was there, but going side to side so that we don't see a really hard edge to that shadow. And making sure to connect that to that buffer zone. So if you don't connect your buffer zone seamlessly, then you get what looks like just sort of this weird outline within the shadow. You don't want that. As we've discussed, you know, we're avoiding outlines where we can. You may have places where you need to use outlines, and that's fine, but you want to keep them minimal. Maybe keep those outlines kind of subtle. And no outlines on your shadows. Outlines on shadows are just weird looking. Shadows do not have firm edges, let alone outlines. So your shadow could be just one consistent value, or you can use your gradation on there as well. And again, I'm trying to create that back and forth, reinforcing the horizontal marks of the table. I should say the horizontal marks reinforce the horizontal surface of the table. Otherwise, it has the tendency to just pop up visually to your eye. All right, and so there I go. I've got my ellipse form of my shadow, and I might need to go back in there and touch up some places. I think I see some places where maybe I see a little bit of rough spots where it's kind of transitioning values too quickly, but yeah, but this is pretty close. So shadows can look all different ways depending on the light source, the angle of the light, that kind of thing. So if you are drawing from life, just always make sure you really look and see, okay, where does that shadow visually seem to touch the object? You know, if I did it way up here, it might look odd. So just looking to see where is that actually visually looking like it is touching to me. Okay, that's looking pretty good. The one part of this that is sort of awkward and unfinished still is this part up at the top. So that would be the part then that I'm going to come back to. And I'm going to make sure, I talked about this I think in the last video, that I don't want this shadow around here to look really odd. So I am going to make sure that I give that a little bit of a smoother gradation. So that's going to mean that I'm going to have to shade a little bit harder in some places. So shade a little harder or keep going with the shading in these areas where it's transitioning. And the direction of your mark still counts, so make sure that you're keeping that kind of in line. So I have to kind of go carefully this way at that edge, but then I'm switching to a more, I'm trying to transition those marks to that more back and forth horizontal line. And really up close I can kind of see where that original outline is versus the shading, so I'm working really, really hard right there to make sure that that transitions. And the reason that's a little bit trickier there is because I was pressing a little harder to make sure I got enough contrast. So that's why if you don't have to press really hard, you want to avoid it when you can. Because it does just then have a different look to it that's harder to kind of really blend smoothly. So I'm going to keep working on that. So I have a 2B graphite stick. I could even go, and we have some 4B graphite sticks as well, so I might go and get one of those to make sure that that transition occurs nicely. So you can definitely see how that transition is still a little awkward. So I'm going to keep working on that area. So just basically doing all the same things I'm doing. Another place that I'm going to work, I'm going to come back to that and maybe do a little bit more of that off camera since it's going to take me a little bit of time. I might also want to add, I think this front part of this is looking just a little bare, so I might come back in here with my blending tool and add a little bit of shadow. So I want to be careful with that. Don't want to go over any of these edges. If I do go over these edges accidentally, then I just go back in and I'm going to use a little bit of the pencil again. So if you have these areas that kind of stick out where you started with your shading, you can just go back in and try to get those to blend in. So getting my blending tool a little bit dirtier again. So I still want to have these contrasting areas. So not getting too dark, especially at that corner of the box. So as I'm going back up and firming up these lines, these edges, you do have to then connect that to the shading. If I just go back and firm up that line, then it's going to look like a line. So I work on the edge, but then connect that to the rest of the shading. All right, my contacts are making this a little harder, but hopefully that looks okay to you viewers. I think that's looking pretty good. I can probably, I want to make sure that this doesn't look like sort of a weird edge in here. And I can shape this as needed. And I am shading a little bit onto that front side of the box because it was having a little bit of like a white highlight kind of effect that I did not like. And see how I'm rotating that so that as I then blend it, I can really, really make sure that I'm getting right up to that edge, just the way I want. I'm going to pause the camera, I think, while I get a darker graphite stick for that top area. Okay, I have my darker graphite stick. I do like to snap them in half, so you may not always see whether it says 2B or 4B on it, but as soon as you pick it up, this is like coming off of my hands. It's obviously darker. If you're not sure, you can test it on some paper, but literally as soon as I pick it up, it's making a big mess. So definitely softer, definitely darker. And then that's just making it a little bit easier, making my life easier as I want to create darker values up here in this top part of my drawing. Watch out for little pieces of eraser underneath there, since they will create their own texture marks. And just working to connect all of these. So this is all fascinating video watching, but I create these videos so that you can see all of the little things I'm doing if you are struggling. So you know, this is what you do as an artist. You just kind of keep working at it until it really looks the way you want it to look. And that may mean going over a certain part once, twice, 3, 4 times, even more. Just working on that until you get the smooth transition you're looking for. And I find that you usually have to keep this going a little further than you think you do. You know, people will just kind of stop right there. But that it's very, very obvious that they kind of stopped right there and created this sort of like thick outline or thick border, but not really a gradation. So I have noticed that sometimes in these spaces where the directionality is not as important, I can actually use a little bit of a circular mark. And you don't really see it. I wouldn't want to see that circular mark, but that kind of makes it feel blendy. If in doubt, though, go with the direction of the edge. So horizontal is what I am also going with. All right, so there may be a few little places to touch up, so that's where you always make sure that you build in enough time in your projects to take a moment to look at them and revise. So I very well may come back to this and see little areas. I'm already starting to see where along that tabletop, for example, might be just slightly bumpy. Just need to make sure I got right up to the correct line, since I had drawn a couple lines before I was happy with where that tabletop was. And if you don't like that texture up there, or you want to help blend, of course, you can use your blending tool to tone that down a little bit. So you don't want to use your blending tool everywhere. Notice you do still see a lot of the marks I made, and again, those are supporting the form. If you apply your blending tool everywhere, one danger is that you will blur your edges, but another danger is just losing all the texture. Just a very smooth blendy, cloudy texture everywhere, honestly does not necessarily make for the most interesting drawings. So you want a little bit of variety in texture. Yes, there are places where you may want that smooth, blendy look, but in other places, being able to see a little bit more the texture in the marks, as long as it's controlled and it's supporting the form, that can actually be really a good thing. So I've chosen that, okay, maybe I'll give this kind of the blendy texture, but I'm not going to then go through the rest of it. And I may even find, you know what, yeah, that helped a bit, but I may even find, you know what, maybe I want to go back and even go over that and add in just a little bit more texture. And if you go too dark, you can go ahead and erase areas, so that can actually often help you get to the texture you want. I think other than a few little pencil shavings, eraser things, that's pretty much what I'm going for. You can erase a little bit into some of these areas. My hands now are just covered with that graphite from the 4B, so I've got to be really, really careful. If I weren't recording a video, I would probably go just wash my hands before finishing this. But so instead, what I'm doing is using that paper towel again. All right, so since I want to be really careful about picking this up, I can pick it up with the paper towel too. So other than a few of those stray erasers that I can't seem to get rid of, I think that's pretty much a wrap. So I would put my name on the back of that. I would photograph that if I were a student to go ahead and turn that in. And that's a wrap. The end.